Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and today's episode is another one in our set of AI case studies. And I'm happy to introduce Paul Gaspar. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, Will. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Paul, tell me about your first case study that you want to share of how you've, helped implement or work with artificial intelligence at one of your clients.
Sounds great. Well, the situation I'm going to describe here was at a major global insurance conglomerate that was faced with pressure to streamline operations and reduce cost within its auto business in Japan. I was in a role leading the data science function for the company, so I was actually employed by this company and was fortunate to have the ability in my role to look at a wide range of functional areas for opportunities to deliver value with analytics. I had long suspected that the claims area in insurance was a target-rich environment for delivering value with advanced analytics and technology. And for those who aren't as familiar with the insurance landscape, claims and handling I think everybody can relate to auto insurance, but claims is one part of the insurance value chain that is very, very closely linked to direct cash outlays for the company, right? So if you and I were to have an accident, we would be paying for the damage of a car or an injury, those types of things. And so it's obviously a very immediate and direct expense for the company. It's often commonly said within the industry that claims is where the big checks are written, and anything that you can do to improve performance in this area has a good chance of falling straight to the bottom line in terms of performance. So I had a strong hypothesis that there was opportunity here. And I had my team take a careful look into the inner workings of the organization that handled the auto business and saw that their processes, while very highly structured and handled with great care, weren't necessarily designed around efficient utilization of resource. So what you would find is that similar processes were being utilized on claims irrespective of the size of that claim. So we saw similar levels of work effort being put towards all claims, whether they were valued at $500 or $50,000. So therein lies sort of the opportunity here. We recognize that by being able to put analytical rigor behind a claims estimation process, we'd not only be able to save significant processing effort, but also shorten the response time to our end customers on a large portion of claims volume. And so what we did in this case was to take a careful look at information flows at various points in the process. And specifically, we looked at information that we collected at the time of the accident to really kind of evaluate how this information could be used to provide insight on losses. And using this information, we built predictive models using AI techniques that would allow us to predict the ultimate value of these claims from a dollar perspective, using a subset of the initial information that was collected at the time of loss. And by being able to build models that could do this quickly and accurately at the very beginning of the process, we were able to set some thresholds that would allow for automated processing and payment of claims amounts on about a quarter of the total claims volume. So as mentioned, this not only reduced the workload for the team that was handling the claims, but also sped responsiveness to customers that had these small claim amounts. So I've kind of blown through this in pretty short order. I've provided a bit of overview and context and the approach that we took. And I just want to stress that though it sounds relatively straightforward, it glosses over a lot of the details and the analytical work, and specifically the change management that was needed to deliver value. So on the data and the modeling side, we had to take careful and a careful inventory, as I mentioned, of data. We would kind of look at the quality and the consistency of this information. We then did a lot of experimentation around what was viable to use or not use in the modeling. We also spent significant time working to find modeling approaches that could provide the right levels of accuracy and decision-making agility that we needed for this segmentation to be meaningful. Let me just stop here. I've been rambling on for a bit. Do you have any questions, Will, or things that you want to probe on at this point?
Yes, I do. I'd love it if you could unpack the one sentence on, we built predictive models using AI techniques. So for a consultant who is, let's say, has not done that before, could you tell us a bit more of a how-to guide, as if you were explaining this to a friend who's going to have to go do this now for a client? What's involved in that in terms of what's the preconditions required, what sort of technology is used for someone who's not a technologist? What has to happen to complete that sentence that you did?
Yeah, for sure. So, look, I think the first thing is really kind of an assessment of the types of information that exist and to assess sort of the quality, the consistency, and the reliability of that information. It all starts with data, obviously. And I think beyond that, and this is interaction and good coordination is needed with people who are kind of experienced at kind of using different types of modeling techniques, working within sort of programming languages. So we used Python to investigate particular approaches to the type of modeling that we would be able to use. And then there's obviously kind of a great deal of testing of results to be able to see kind of which particular data elements and characteristics are useful for creating what we call signal, i.e., getting meaningful insight and being able to kind of help differentiate the evaluation of one claim versus another, like were there injuries, were there not injuries, kind of data that you would have, quantitative data, being able to kind of create a mix of that qualitative and quantitative data, right? So this is not something necessarily that a data analyst with minimal data science knowledge could actually do and execute. But in terms of like kind of a step-by-step approach, I think, there's sort of an evaluation of the data. There's thinking about what kind of modeling techniques are viable, being able to experiment with those modeling techniques, and then see if those modeling techniques are performant, not only in terms of the accuracy of the predictions that they're making, but also the speed and the processing power at which are needed to actually kind of execute. So at a high level, that's sort of like the steps that I would take. Again, models can have varying levels of sophistication, and I was fortunate to kind of have a team of very experienced data scientists to help me work through the technical approach and the modeling techniques that were utilized in this case.
So, at a big picture, as a first step, you need to do an inventory of all the data that exist or the inputs to the process, like what data is captured at the beginning. You want to capture the historically that incoming data as well as the decisions that were made by the humans who were doing the process. And then it sounds like you would test and iterate and build an algorithmic model that would try to, I imagine, come relatively close to the humans or maybe make better decisions if we think the humans were not making good decisions. If you thought humans were already making optimal decisions, then you see if you can make an algorithm to match that using all or some subset of that input data. And then that would validate if you're going to be able to use AI to sort of simplify the process in some of the cases. Tell me if I missed anything there, and also maybe get into that sounds simple, but in practice for a consultant who's going to go do something like this, what are some of the watchouts or some of the tips or some of the lessons learned that make it tricky to do in practice?
Sure. So look, I think that just to add to your comment earlier, one of the things we looked at very carefully is we didn't kind of pretend to think that we could build precision across all of the various claims types. I think one of the key kind of phrases here is to segment claims in a way that was very much acceptable to everyone who was managing and accountable for the process. And so what we tried to do is find ways to segment claims by value and to look at the ones with the lowest value and to be able to reliably identify those claims, right? So the risk of mishandling that claim, even if you paid it and auto-processed it, the risk of what we call leakage, and that means for overpaying for those types of claims relative to the cost of processing them was actually quite minimal. So I think one thing to remember is that, to some degree, this is sort of predictive analytics is a bit of art and science, and you need to be very careful about how and where you use it, and that the risks are well understood and weigh well against kind of the benefit that you hope to get from the process. I think that's sort of one thing that I would try and highlight. And then as to the second part of your question regarding watchouts, There are a lot of companies nowadays who recognize and see the value of investing in analytical teams and being able to make kind of data-driven decisions. That said, one should always remember, in my view, all of the change management work that needs to happen around the intelligence and the data that is used in the decision-making process. So in the case I just talked about, in order to turn this into a working, scalable business process, we had to work in many different functional areas. So it's not just about kind of saying, okay, we've been able to segment the claims into kind of high and low value, and those that are meant for auto processing and those that need to go through the traditional process. We had to work very, very closely to think about, well, how does this information get passed into our payment systems? How does the automation impact our existing process flow? And how can we make sure that it doesn't disrupt the process? How do you actually contact customers and make them aware of potential process changes that are beneficial for them in many cases, but are we ready from a communications perspective to be able to share this change and share how it benefits them, right? So I would tend to say that in my experience, what people have underestimated is the amount of work, change management, planning, and execution that is needed for an analytically driven solution to deliver business value.
How did you think about, you don't want to replicate human errors if there was such a thing. So I could imagine with claims process with the humans, initially, the existing set of data, there could be two types of errors. One might be false positives and false negatives. So false positive would be if you pay a claim that you should not have, right? And a false negative would be if you deny a claim that you should have paid. So you're trying to get your algorithm to make good decisions. Was that an issue? Or when you looked at those false negatives and false positives by the humans, maybe that was just such a small component that you didn't worry about it. But if it was big, you wouldn't want to train your AI to match humans if the humans were overpaying in some cases.
No, it's a great point. And in fact, that's one of the very time-consuming parts of the process, right? Is to work with people that are kind of responsible for handling claims to be able to show them the performance of the models and looking specifically at sort of your false positives and negatives and assessing what types of errors tend to show up in those respective buckets. And then to further tweak the processes in a way that with models and also with human judgment about kind of thresholds for error tolerance, right? To set parameters around which this process will work and where it actually does need to get reviewed by humans. So yeah, again, this is sort of where I talk a little bit about risk management and taking care to do adequate testing and planning for those contingencies where your systems may be making mistakes. And to be clear, right, one of the things that has emerged over the years is sort of this whole kind of notion of machine learning ops, right? And one of the things that ML ops accounts for is the performance or the drift of model performance over time and the need to be able to continually look at how models are performing, adjust them where needed, and really kind of weigh and understand where the models are making accurate decisions and where they're making mistakes.
Yes, say more about that. So you wouldn't want your model to start feeling like overly sympathetic with with the person. Maybe you were not using a Gen AI model that was taking all into account. It was more of a straight up symbols and numbers kind of thing. But you would want, I guess you have to have some testing and monitoring over time to make sure it's continuing to perform how you expect and rejecting some claims or not overpaying claims. Like how do you do that monitoring?
Yeah, look, in the past, it was sort of a highly manual exercise. I think, there have been toolkits and now software, commercially available software programs that allow for systematic kind of monitoring of decisions, right? So there's entire ecosystems that are being built and created and maintained by the companies that do this well. Again, we managed it kind of early days by doing a lot of testing and very careful setting of thresholds So what I mean to say is that at certain points, processing time versus sort of the error, that trade-off was something that was kind of acceptable, right? And you could set your thresholds and your claim, kind of what would get auto-processed at levels that were acceptable from a risk perspective.
I think you had some thoughts about the broader context and impact and implications of this.
Yeah, look, I think you kind of alluded to this earlier. The example that I went through was much more of an example that we were focused on predictive AI, right? So there is this new, and if you haven't had your head in the sand, prevalent discussion going on around generative AI, right? Which is actually, I think, a bit different, where what you're doing is you're kind of taking existing knowledge bases and training models to generate content that is most, from a probabilistic standpoint, most likely to be connected to, related to, or relevant to a query that an end user puts in, right? So this is sort of the basis of the foundational models that are being used by OpenAI, Perplexity, and others to create what is sort of a very new and interesting paradigm and use case for predictive AI, or excuse me, for generative AI. And what I think this does is it's sort of a very different kind of evolutionary phase. And it's very exciting to everyone who experiments with generative AI because of the accessibility, the power of the tools, even in the earliest stages of its development. Considering how intuitive it is, because you're simply just sort of chatting with a model, the speed and the relatively low cost of experimentation with these models, and the new range of capabilities that these tools can deliver, it's hard not to get excited about how these mechanisms can transform almost any business process that they're going to touch in the future. So to get a bit more specific, for those who've been following generative AI tools, you've sort of seen in the last several months how they've moved to become multimodal. And what I mean by that is the ability to take not just kind of textual chatting type of an input, but also to take voice inputs or image inputs or video inputs and to respond to queries about that type of content. And if you think about kind of these various types of pools of information that are now fairly seamlessly collected in this kind of mobile first world that we have, you can think about an incredible range of possibilities that are enabled, even in the example that we started this conversation with, auto claims, right? So in this example, we saw that one of the most challenging aspects of the claims is figuring out accurate costs. And when you think about the forms of information that can be brought now to this evaluation process, whether it's video or pictures or voice notes, you could easily see how one could, by kind of incorporating this information, being able to take relevant pieces and building kind of some know-how that is embedded within the professional staff that you have, how the estimation process could change, not just for the small kind of low value subset of claims, but increasingly move higher into not only value, but also sophistication of the claims that are there. So again, I think that this type of multimodal input, the ability to access not only from a practitioner standpoint, but also from an end user standpoint, the ease with which you're able to kind of interact with and provide information to these tools is really quite the game changer that is getting everyone very excited about these particular vehicles in the future.
Excellent. Paul, for listeners that want to follow up with you, where would you point them online?
Yeah, no, you can kind of look me up on LinkedIn. I'm very accessible via there. Reachable at Paul Gaspar, PaulGaspar.
Fantastic. Paul, it's been fantastic. You talked about how it's not just about coming up with the algorithm, but much more than we realize. There's all this change management to get a corporation to do things in a new way, to use these AI tools. And that was a real valuable for me to hear that. Thank you so much for joining today. This was a great discussion.
Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be here.